There aren't many books on Australian Jewish history at all, and there particularly aren't many on Victorian Jewish history. What I set out to do was not to write a communal history at all, but to write a thematic history. And what I'm particularly interested in is giving the context for the Jewish community, not seeing them in isolation, but seeing them as within the international world that they're operating on. I'm an urban historian, so my interest is in cities and buildings. And so I set out to try and explain who this community was within the context of world Jewry and world history of the 19th century, and to put that within an urban history context and a political context of how does a community develop and how does it influence the place that it is developing within. And so that communal development rather than communal history is what I'm interested in. And that development can be social, political, architectural, economic, as well as communally, religiously, that sort of history. That's a very interesting question, because where does research start and at what point do you formulate your research into a structure? I originally set out to write about buildings and the buildings these people lived in, because my background is as a curator of historic buildings. And in looking at buildings and the built environment and that very narrow perspective of urban history, I realised there was actually a much bigger story to tell. And that story is one of settlement. And this Australia is unique in being the only place that Jews are there at first settlement. And in Victoria, Jews were part of the Port Phillip Association that illegally settled what became Victoria, and Jews were there at the first land sales. So what's really interesting from a Jewish history perspective is Jews are there forming society, and their community, they come to a community where there is absolutely nothing, and therefore they have to form a community that reflects their own presence and their own position in society and the society in which they're forming. And so that was what ended up being the really, really interesting thing for me. And I did say I didn't write a communal history, but I wrote a history of a community and how that community forms and why it forms the way it does. But I'm also really interested in the converse of that, which is how does it form the society, the wider society in which it's living, and how does the Jewish community politically, economically structure a society that suits itself. And I think this community was really influential in doing that, particularly around issues that they thought, because they're politically active, and I'll get onto that topic later, but they are able to insert values that they think are important into public debates. And particularly in things like education and in tax reform, and then structure a society that was reflecting them and their needs as much as the wider needs of this community. I like the concept of a network because it covers lots of the different themes my book covers. Primarily, I was responding to a whole lot of academic research that's very topical at present about the British Empire and the networks that came to produce the British Empire. And that's about the movement of goods, people and ideas around the empire. But that literature really sees the empire as white and Protestant. There's a little bit of acknowledgement of Chinese import and a little bit of acknowledgement of Irish import, but they don't see the empire as culturally diverse. And obviously a gold rush brought lots of people to Victoria from lots of parts of the world, and as did the Jewish community. And so the Jewish community of Melbourne, although it's primarily British, it's also Central European, Eastern European, Northern European, from Turkey, Egypt, North Africa, the Caribbean. So those networks are coming to bear on colonial development. And I think the Jewish community has a number of networks of its own in the 19th century. Obviously, those British settlers are coming with the British Empire, and some of those people have worked within the empire, they've traded in India, or they've traded in the Caribbean. But the Jewish community also has its historic European diaspora, North African diaspora, Sephardi diaspora. And then at this period, there's a rapidly building English-speaking diaspora. And so you find people in Australia who have experienced or go on to experience living in New Zealand, South Africa, the Americas, and they travel around and they're trading, they're communicating around those networks. You have people in Victoria being a correspondents for European Jewish newspapers. The British Jewish Press, the Jewish Chronicle, is reporting what's happening in Victoria, often in more detail than it is in other regional provincial cities of Britain. And then you have familial networks. So you find that people are doing chain migrations, they're marrying in particular patterns. Often people marry in silos. So my family may not marry your family, but they may go and marry this family over here. Then there's networks of what people are doing. So business networks, political networks, social networks. So this community, it's a complex network, and even the cover of my book, which is a network. Thank you. That's a group of people who are connected familially, but they're also connected through business. They're also connected through place. And so I think those networks were really, really interesting to explore. For example, there's a group of people in Melbourne I found in the 1850s English census records, which are all lodgers in a Prussian Jewish family living in Sheffield who are watchmakers and jewellers. And the people who are lodgers or visitors are actually listed as visitors, but I think they're lodgers in this house, are also Prussian-born jewellers. And they all come to the goldfields and they all go into business together. They marry over 2 generations, their children marry each other. And so they're all Prussian-born jewellers who've lived for a number of years, in some instances being born in Sheffield, and they come to the goldfields and go into business. So those networks are quite complex in some instances. I think this is a really interesting issue, and I think it's a big theme in my book. What happens is Victoria, has this mass migration in the early 1850s due to the gold rush. But even before that, and that coincides fundamentally with the last points of emancipation for Jews in Britain and for the 1848, post-1848 revolutions. Now, those revolutions in Europe also created a level of emancipation for Jews in Europe. But what happens in Australia more widely and in Victoria is that Jews go into civil life as members of parliament, as members of city councils, as JPs, as magistrates, almost or slightly earlier than final emancipation occurs in Britain. So although the laws of Britain were transferred to the colonies until they were superseded by colonial law, Jews are elected to or put themselves forward for civic office before those laws are rescinded. And so as soon as any form of civic life is established in the Victorian colonies, Jews are putting their hands up to be participants in those. So you have the first person standing for the Melbourne City Council in 1842, Asher Hyman Hart. You had the first Jewish mayor of Melbourne in 1870. And so from that period, you're getting Jews are very, very actively participating in civil life. You have Jews, and what's really interesting is Jews become consuls, honorary consuls for countries, very, very commonly for America, Prussia, Italy, all sorts of places. And in some instances, they're acting as consuls in countries where they wouldn't actually be allowed to do that in the country they're representing as Jews. The other thing that happens is Jews who weren't British born rapidly take up naturalisation in Victoria. And that allows them to buy property. And that property allows them to be ratepayers, and as ratepayers, they can vote. And so, whereas in lots of other places, Jews are excluded from voting, in Victoria, as long as you were a ratepayer, you could vote. So there's this really groundswell of participation politically in Australia and in Victoria specifically. Now this gets back to my first interest, which is the buildings of Melbourne. What's really interesting is in Melbourne that Jews didn't form any form of ghetto. So what I'm going to say now, you've got to remember there was no ghetto, but there were specific, excuse me, specific areas of Melbourne that Jews, and they can be a block of terraces or a street. And I think this ties into social mobility, and it ties into the strong familial connections this community had. The Jews of Melbourne were using the most prominent architects in Melbourne to build their, or if you're wealthy enough, to build your private residence. And they were using those architects for their civic buildings. So some of the areas of Melbourne that we can see today is, if you think of the top end of Victoria Parade, opposite St Vincent's Hospital, and there are some extant mansions left there, but around the east of the Iron Ear Hospital, they're all built by Jewish builders, and using the most prominent architects of Melbourne. And both sides of Victoria Parade was a really popular place for Jews to live. And then down Albert Street and into East Melbourne. So when East Melbourne is subdivided for the first land sales, Jews are the principal buyers of that land. And that beautiful row of terraces on the corner of Lansdowne Street and Albert Street, that it turns the corner, it's about, I don't know, 16 houses, I quite should know the number. That is built by a Jewish developer and lived in half by Jews and half not by Jews. So that's another common thing, that even these very prominent Jewish areas, there's still sort of other people living there. There was a street that I'm really interested in that was built in it was a subdivision of the 1850s in Fitzroy that gets rebuilt in the 1860s. It's called King William Street. And if you think about the car park of the museum, so it runs from Nicholson Street back to Brunswick Street, and about where the car park of the museum is, it's a really narrow little street, rebuilt in the 1860s and lived in by two really prominent families. Lots and lots of Jews lived there, but two prominent Jewish families lived there. A family called Levy and Levi. And so the first Jewish parliamentarian in Victoria is Nathaniel Levi, the great-grandfather of Rabbi John Levi. And his family, his father-in-law lives in that street, also called Levy, and he was a cousin. And so that whole street, there's many, many people, extended Levi-Levy families. And the other family that's very prominent that lives in that street are the Phillipses. Solomon David Phillips came to Victoria trying to be a rabbi. He'd been a rabbi, or they weren't trained as rabbis, but in New South Wales. And he came to Victoria, and his extended family lived in that street, his daughters particularly, and their husbands. One of those daughters was Rosetta, and she married a man called Alexander Fox. Alexander Fox was a photographer who found it quite difficult to make a living in Victoria. And in 1865, their son, Emmanuel Phillips Fox, is born in that street, the artist. And so you get these little concentrations. If you think of Brunswick Street and Gertrude Street, there's Glass Terrace, which is the earliest terrace house that's left in Melbourne. And it's built by a man called Hugh Glass, who also built the slightly grander house on the building on the corner facing Brunswick Street. If you read the consummation analysis for those buildings, it talks about the prominent doctors and lawyers who lived in those buildings. What it doesn't mention is it's the home to a whole interconnected group of ex-Jewish convicts and who've made good and can live in middle-class Melbourne. When we think about the synagogues the Jewish community built, they're using, again, the most prominent architects of the time. And the one that I think is particularly interesting is the East Melbourne Hebrew Congregation. So they built their first iteration of their building in what was called Stephen Street at the time, got renamed Exhibition Street because of its bad reputation. And at the time, they're using the architects who are building Parliament House around the corner at the same period. So they build quite a modest building, but they've picked the same architects that are building Parliament House. Now, in the 1870s, their building's too small. They become a much more prominent community. You know, they're living in East Melbourne, and they want to move. So where do they move to? They move to the most prominent position in Victoria, if you think about it religiously and politically. They moved to Albert Street, right opposite, you know, across the road effectively from Parliament House, right near the Catholic Cathedral. And when East Melbourne is laid out, it's laid out with spaces for the different church denominations. And it gets its cachet because the Anglican Church builds its bishop's residence in East Melbourne. And that gives the area a huge cachet. And so where does the East Melbourne Hebrew congregation move to? They move to this position in Albert Street amongst all these churches, the Catholic Cathedral, the Parliament House, and they pick, very interestingly, some very fashionable architects called Crouch and Wilson. Now, Crouch and Wilson had built a lot of the houses for the Jewish community, including some of those in Victoria Parade, but they're also famous for building churches. Thomas Crouch was a Wesleyan and Quaker background, and they built 40 churches in Victoria and Tasmania. But they don't build anything that looks like a church. They build a sort of Renaissance palace. And then what do? They put a Magen David on the outside and they write their name in Hebrew. So they're in the middle of this political, religious space with their name emblazoned on Hebrew across the front. And I think that's a really big political statement. Now, this is a really interesting question. The community survived, and I think I'll take two tacks on this. The community certainly survived, but what I think isn't recognised in the community we live in, that Anglo Jewry and the way it manifests itself in Victoria was different to the way Judaism manifests itself in Eastern Europe. And that's because of the different political position of Jewry in England compared to Eastern Europe. In England, by the mid-19th century, English Jewry are citizens of the country and they're fully emancipated. They can participate in government, in the judiciary, and so they see themselves as Englishmen and Jews. Now, that has often been seen as a criticism by those who study Eastern European history, but I think it's to do with the fact that, in fact, there was a very big concentration of Jewry in England from the 18th century onwards. And it took a long time for the emancipation to occur, but unlike other parts of Europe, the political emancipation was very light compared to what was happening in Eastern Europe. And so Jews were participating fully in society. So of course they saw themselves as citizens of the society in which they were given equal rights. But being Jewish was also very important. And so maintaining Judaism was important to them. But unlike in Eastern Europe, being a member of a Jewish community was a choice. You didn't have to be a member of a Jewish community. So in a society where Judaism is a matter of choice, it's a different structure. So you don't have a killer managing your taxation, your marriage rituals. That's all that the state is doing that. And so the Judaism formed differently because it was freed from some of those constraints. In Victoria, they're Anglo Jews who are coming to a place where there is nothing. And so they're saying, how do we create Jewish institutions that reflect ourselves? And so they created, by the mid-19th century, there are 6 synagogues in Victoria. There's Melbourne, East Melbourne, St Kilda. There are synagogues in Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong. And minor communities like Castlemaine, Beechworth, they're trying to find ways to hold services as well. They're borrowing material from different synagogues on the high holy days and that sort of thing. So it survived, but it was an Anglo and an Anglo-Australian form of Judaism. It wasn't halachically incorrect. It was just a Judaism formed in a place of emancipation. The other issue to remember in 19th century Jewry in Australia is there are very few Jewish women. there is twice as many Jewish men as Jewish women. And so the reality is Jewish men couldn't always marry Jewish women because there weren't Jewish women for them to marry. So the issue of conversion is one that occupies the synagogue boards for most of the 19th century. And it's a real issue of angst. And it wasn't until 1864 that the first Beth Din is established. And it all still had to go back through the chief rabbi in England because all the synagogues here had, or the city ones had, sworn allegiance, so to speak, to the chief rabbi in England, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. And so they put in place quite complex ways in which women could be converted. And conversions did take place, and it's still within individuals a very touchy issue. But and you find people who may have married civilly 20 years before who finally managed to convert their children. And the letters are, you know, saying we have kept a Jewish house, our children have been brought up with religious education. So they're really, really trying to do it. Now, the reality is in urban societies throughout the 19th century, be they Jewish or not, religion was loosened. The bonds of religion are loosened in urban, you know, that's an effect of urbanism. And in societies, communities where Jews were living in those urban societies, outmarriage occurs. But outmarriage in Victoria actually occurred far less than in places like Berlin and Vienna and the great Jewish cities we see in Europe. So yes, outmarriage occurred, but to a lesser extent and within these unusual circumstances where there were very few Jewish women to marry. So it wasn't until the 20th century that the numbers actually even up.